On a winter's day in White Hollow, a wind from the mountaintop carried a deep, biting chill, pulling dark clouds across the sky as if heralding a great storm. In the midst of a town wrapped in swirling snow, two young sisters stepped out of their music lesson with the warmth of a violin song and bright smiles, only to vanish into the endless white. News spread quickly, and among the worried faces, one man and his German shepherd quietly set out crossing deep forest trails, following the faintest traces through the blizzard. Each step in the thick snow was a heartbeat of hope, leading toward a moment the entire town would remember forever. Follow the story to discover what awaited them ahead. Mornings in White Hollow often began with the gentle soundtrack of mountain life, the soft chime of wind bells swaying on porch eaves, the slow rumble of wagon wheels over cobblestone streets, and the warm laughter of vendors setting up their stalls in the central market. The town lay nestled deep in a valley, embraced by slopes draped in evergreen pines, with narrow streams weaving their quiet song through the seasons. Winters here were cold, yet beautiful as if painted by careful hands. Wooden rooftops resting under a veil of snow, thin plumes of chimney smoke curling upward, and the pale morning sun filtering through a veil of light mist. But that morning the calm felt more fragile than usual. A wind from the mountaintop carried with it an unfamiliar chill, while a dark bank of clouds crept slowly, yet with purpose across the sky, a quiet herald of something drawing near. In White Hollow, the elders often read the clouds like pages in a book, and some of them had already changed course, heading home earlier than they would on any other day. On the southern street of town stood a small wooden house with blue-painted windows, home to sisters Aria and Maeve. Aria, the elder by minutes, was only 8, but carried a maturity beyond her years. She loved music, especially the voice of the violin tending to each note, as though every sound held a precious memory. Maeve, her twin, was a freer spirit, quick, curious, and often the spark behind their wildest games. Different as they were, they moved through the world as one able to speak volumes through a glance or a brush of the hand. That morning, after a breakfast of toast drizzled with honey, the sisters bundled into their warm coats, carrying their instrument case and sheet music on their way to Mrs. Ivy's class in the heart of town. Maeve sang to herself as they walked, while Aria plucked a few quiet notes, the violin's voice ringing clear in the crisp air. From afar, the church bell tolled, calling the town into a new day. A few streets away, the White Hollow police station was quieter than usual. Lieutenant Caleb Rowan was finishing a report from a weekend rescue. Though not born here, more than 10 years of service had woven him into the fabric of the community. His tall frame, steady gaze, and calm, deep voice carried reassurance wherever he appeared. Beside him sat Aster, a German shepherd with a black and gold coat, ears pricked like sentinels, and eyes so sharp they seemed to read the world itself. Together, Caleb and Aster had weathered some of the valley's hardest trials, finding lost hikers in the deep woods, pulling trapped victims from snowstorms. Once Aster had detected a skier buried far beneath the drifts when all hope seemed gone. Since that day, he had been more than Caleb's partner. He had become a living emblem of trust and hope. Caleb bent to pat Aster's neck. The dog tilted his head in response, tail swaying lightly, gaze bright with anticipation for the next mission. Their bond was not just built in moments of danger, but in quiet ones like this, when a single glance was enough to affirm they were a team. Outside the station window, the clouds had thickened, swallowing the morning light into a heavy iron-gray sky. The cold pushed down the streets, making passers-by pull scarves higher. In the corner cafe, the owner tossed another log into the fire, muttering that the wind smelled different today. At the market, vegetable sellers hurried their crates inside, and children abandoned snowball fights to run home at their parents' call. Aria and Maeve paid little attention to these signs. Today's music lesson was special. Mrs. Ivy was teaching an old White Hollow folk song, one their mother used to hum on winter nights. At the classroom door, Aria adjusted the strap of her violin case while Maeve brushed snowflakes from her hair. Across town, Caleb closed his folder and decided to walk Aster on a patrol around the center. The moment he stepped outside, the cold struck his face like a warning. Aster stood close, eyes sweeping over the streets, his breath curling into thin clouds in the air. Above, a sudden burst of crows tore across the sky, wings beating hard, their calls echoing over the somber horizon. Caleb looked up, a fleeting unease in his chest. Then he turned to Aster with a small smile, reminding himself that harsh winters were nothing new here. In White Hollow, winter was always a test. But the people believed that unity and resolve could see them through. None of them knew that within hours, a storm unlike any before would sweep into the valley, testing everyone, and beginning a story the town would never forget. The final note of violin that day lingered in the air before fading into the cold. Mrs. Ivy, her silver hair tucked neatly and a burgundy scarf at her neck, set her bow down with a smile of pride. Aria lowered her head in thanks, her smile widening when the teacher praised her for playing with more soul than before. Maeve, seated at the old wooden piano, tapped out a cheerful run of chords as if to bid the class farewell. Outside, the sky had deepened into a darker gray. Snowflakes began to fall, swirling on the wind, before clinging to the glass panes. Mrs. Ivy glanced toward the window, her brow faintly creased. "The wind's here earlier than forecast," she murmured, a hint of concern in her voice. But Aria and Maeve, busy packing up their music, didn't notice. When the others had gone, the sisters lingered to tidy away the violin case and a few loose sheets of music. Their practice had kept them later than usual. Aria slung the case over her shoulder, double-checking the clasp, while Maeve dashed to the backyard where their homemade sled waited by the wall. It was their summer project. 2 long planks, wooden wheels salvaged from an old stroller, and a handle carved from a curved branch. Last winter they had ridden it down the North Hill again and again, each descent ending in breathless laughter. Maeve placed her small hands on the sled's handlebar, eyes sparkling. "Just a bit of snow. The road should be slick enough for a fast run. If we take this way, we'll get home quicker." Aria hesitated, glancing up at the sky. The wind was stronger than when they had arrived for class, but not yet fierce. Walking home would take nearly an hour, while riding the sled down the hill would be only 20 minutes. The thought of getting back sooner, sitting by the fire, listening to their mother's stories, tipped her decision. She nodded. They were just about to leave the yard when a voice called from beyond the fence. "Girls, Mr. Garrison." Mrs. Ivy's neighbor, stepped out from his shed. He was a sturdy man in middle age, usually dressed in a thick wool sweater and a gray fedora. "The storm today will be worse than the last few days. You should stick to the main road. Don't take the north slope. The wind's too strong there." Aria paused, a twinge of doubt in her chest. Maeve grinned back. "We know, sir, but it's just a little snow. We'll be home in no time." Mr. Garrison frowned, about to say more when a sudden gust whipped across the yard, carrying a swirl of white that made him shield his eyes. By the time he looked again, the sisters had already pushed the sled through the back gate, the wooden wheels crunching over the thin layer of ice. The path down the north slope began as a narrow trail winding through bare maple trees. The ground was dusted with a thin cover of snow, but underneath lay slick ice from earlier freezing rain. Maeve sat in front steering, while Aria held the violin case and sheet music tight against her arms, wrapped firmly around her sister's waist. Maeve kicked off hard, the sled jolting forward, wheels scraping the ice with a dry, sharp sound. At first it was exhilarating. Wind lashed their faces, carrying the scent of pine resin. The trees flew past in a blur, and Maeve's laughter rose above the sled's rattling. Aria joined in, feeling the cold bite playfully at her cheeks. Even in the fading light, the white path stretched ahead, clear and inviting. but halfway down the sky, suddenly dimmed. A wall of heavy black clouds swept over the mountaintop, swallowing the light. The wind howled harder, and fat snowflakes began to spin into twisting white ribbons before their eyes. Maeve squinted, gripping the handlebar tight as the sled shuddered under them. Almost there, Maeve shouted, trying to beat the wind's roar. Aria tightened her hold, sensing the sled's speed climbing as the slope grew slicker. Beyond the maples, the trail dropped into a long descent with no guardrail. Once their favorite stretch, it now lay stripped bare by the wind, the snow swept clean to reveal a dangerous sheet of glassy ice. The sled shot forward unstoppable. A wheel struck a frozen mound, jolting Maeve off balance. Both girls screamed as the sled veered sharply, skidding off the trail into a narrow, seldom-used track. Branches clawed at their faces. Snow thickened, blurring the world into shifting shadows. Maeve fought the handlebar, but the cramped, uneven track pitched the sled against stones, rattling it violently. Aria's heart pounded. She clutched the violin case and braced herself. A sudden bend loomed. Maeve leaned hard to steer, but momentum was too strong. The sled swung sideways, lost speed, and toppled over. The crash of wood against ice cracked through the air. The girls rolled into the snow, cold, seeping through their coats. Aria scrambled up first and rushed to Maeve. Thankfully, they bore only scrapes and bruised knees. The sled lay tipped near a tree, one wheel thrown several yards away. The wind's scream deepened a wild note that seemed to pour down from the mountain peaks. Silence fell between gusts, broken only by their quickened breaths. Aria scanned the surroundings. This path led deeper into the forest, away from home. The main trail was already lost behind a wall of swirling snow. "Let's find shelter," Aria said, her voice trembling but steady enough. "We'll wait until the wind dies down." Maeve nodded her defiance, now edged with worry. They moved together along a thick stand of trees, snow clinging to branches and tumbling down with every shake of the wind. Before long, a shadow emerged from the white, a small wooden cabin roof, sagging walls weathered by years. They pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the dim light slipped through gaps in the planks. The air smelled of damp wood and cold ash. Aria set the violin case in the corner, while Maeve pulled a frayed blanket from a chair. Outside, the storm was truly gathering. Wind hissed through the cracks, and snow rattled hard against the roof like urgent knocking. In White Hollow, this was only the beginning. But for Aria and Maeve, that afternoon had already turned into a turning point, leading them toward a trial they had never imagined. By late afternoon, the sky over White Hollow was like a taut, heavy blanket, layers of black cloud pressing down into the valley. At the northern ridge, a sudden gust swept over the bare trees, their branches clattering in the cold. The air sliced through every gap, a warning in its bite. At that very moment, Aria and Maeve were on their sled, sliding down the long hill toward home. At first it was smooth. The ice polished the wheels, humming the wind, playful in their hair beneath knitted caps. But then, as though a giant door had been thrown open in the north, a blast of wind roared straight at them. Maeve squinted, one eye shut, leaning into the handlebar. The sled swerved left, a wheel biting into hard ice with a brittle crack. Aria felt the jolt shake through the frame and clung tighter to her sister. Snow was falling heavier now, the flakes large as cotton tufts driven sideways into their faces. "Hold on," Maeve shouted over the gale. But the wind only grew stronger. Trees along the path bent and shivered, branches bare and trembling. The slope ahead, once familiar, became a blinding white void, every boundary between trail and drop erased. Snow swirled in tightening spirals, erasing the world in a heartbeat. The sled began to pick up speed beyond anything they had planned. Each time a wheel struck a patch of ice or a buried stone, the whole frame rattled violently. Aria felt the pace climbing far faster than on any ride, before the cold biting straight into her throat with every breath. She tried to lean to one side and peer past her sister's shoulder, searching for the familiar track, but all she could see was a dense wall of white. Then, without warning, a gust far stronger than any before tore down from the mountain's flank. It slammed into the sled, shoving both girls sharply to the right. Maeve fought the handlebar, trying to steer them back to the center, but the wind's force was too much. The sled slid off its intended path and into a narrower, steeper side trail. Aria. "It's turning!" Maeve shouted, her voice edged with panic. Aria's quick glance told her this track led deep into the forest, a place their parents had once warned them about. Too many rocks, too steep to be safe. But they were already committed, the wheels screaming against the ice like metal scraping glass. On both sides, dark tree trunks whipped past in a blur. The wind howled like a living thing, tangled with the sharp crack of breaking branches. The slope was so slick that every attempt to steer was useless. The wheels followed momentum alone. Aria lowered herself, gripping her sister tighter, her heartbeat hammering in rhythm with each passing second. The descent was longer than they'd imagined. Just as it seemed the slope would ease, a sharp bend appeared hidden until the last moment by a cluster of snow-laden bushes. Maeve wrenched the handlebar left to avoid a massive rock at the edge. But the speed was too great. The sled swung sideways, its whole body tipping toward one side. "Careful," Aria cried. The collision was brutal, the wooden frame smashing against the rock with a splintering crack. The impact threw both girls into the air. They tumbled across the snow, cold seeping instantly through their coats. They rolled several times before coming to rest, breathless and shaken. Aria scrambled up, first snow clinging to her hair and collar. She rushed to Maeve, scanning quickly for any serious injury. Fortunately, apart from bruises and scrapes, her sister was alert. The sled lay sprawled near a tree, one wooden wheel snapped clean off, and lying several yards away, the frame splintered beyond use. The wind still roared, snow thickening by the minute. Every upward glance felt like being pelted by icy stones. Visibility was reduced to a few meters. In every direction, only an endless blinding white. "We're lost," Maeve whispered, her voice trembling. Aria swallowed hard, forcing her tone steady. "Shelter first. We'll figure the rest out later." They clung to each other, moving cautiously over the slick ground, searching for anything familiar. But the storm had erased every trace of their passing. Minutes later, they reached a stand of thick pines, and between the trunks loomed the faint outline of a structure. Closer now, it was a small wooden cabin. Its roof slanted, the door slightly ajar, the walls weathered to a silver gray by years of snow and wind. Aria pushed gently. The hinges gave a weary groan. Inside, dimness reigned, the air thick with the scent of damp timber and cold ash. Maeve found an old wool blanket in a corner, while Aria set the violin case down and leaned against the wall, rubbing her hands to coax warmth into her fingers. Outside, the wind rose in surges, its whistle slipping through the cracks in the door like a relentless refrain. The sky had sunk fully into shades of charcoal, and somewhere beyond the snow curtain, the first true signs of the storm were taking shape. Snow fell so heavily now that each footprint they left vanished within seconds. The wind tore from all directions, shredding their voices into fragments that were lost in the white void. Shivering, gasping, they exhaled clouds of breath that dissolved almost instantly. Aria gripped Maeve's hand, feeling it stiff with cold despite the knitted gloves. In her mind's eye, she saw the familiar road home, the warm glow of White Hollow's street lamps. But here only towering black trunks and a sky pressed close with snow remained. "This way." "I think it's south," Aria tried to call, but the wind snatched half her words. Maeve only nodded, lips tinged blue. They followed a narrow opening between the trees, hoping it would lead toward open ground. But the storm had scoured away every sign. Every tree looked the same, every rock buried under a thick, deceptive white. Aria glanced back every few steps, only to see their trail vanish as though it had never existed. Then came a sound. The dry, splintering snap of a branch breaking somewhere close. Aria froze, pulling Maeve nearer. They held their breath, but only the storm answered. Still, instinct urged them to find cover before the blizzard claimed the forest entirely. A dozen steps later, Maeve tugged on her sister's arm. "Look." Her voice was almost lost to the wind. Through the snow, Aria spotted a darker shape. Not a tree, not a boulder, but the outline of a building. They pushed through low bushes toward it, and it emerged in full, a small sloped roof cabin, its wood scarred by time, the door shuddering on rusted hinges with each gust. Aria stepped forward and pressed lightly. The door swung inward, carrying with it a swirl of dust and the musty smell of neglect. Dim light seeped through gaps between the planks, sliding over forgotten furniture. A broken-legged table, a few chairs overturned, a small hearth buried in cold ash. Maeve slipped in first, brushing off a chair before sitting. Aria closed the door, cutting the wind to a low moan. The air was no warmer, but at least the gale couldn't strike them head-on. "At least, it's safer than out there," Maeve murmured, voice halting. Aria placed the violin case in the corner and searched for anything that might hold warmth. A frayed wool blanket hung on the wall. It was damp to the touch, but thick enough. She pulled it down, wrapping it around both of them. Maeve leaned into her side, her hurried breaths slowing at last. The wind outside seemed sharper now that the sisters sat still. It threaded through the gaps in the roof, whistling long and low like a warning. Now and then clumps of snow slid from the eaves and landed heavily against the door with a muffled thud. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and old ash, a lonely smell that made it feel as though the cabin had been abandoned for many years. Aria unzipped the small pack slung over her shoulder, pulling out a half-full water bottle and passing it to Maeve for a sip. They shared a single wax-wrapped biscuit, holding back enough to preserve what little energy they had left. Neither spoke it aloud, but both understood. If help didn't come soon, the night would be long and bitterly cold. To keep warm, Aria suggested they move a little, stomping their feet, clapping their hands, or rubbing their palms together. Maeve followed her lead, though her eyes still betrayed the fear she couldn't hide. Every so often she glanced toward the door, as if half expecting the white blur beyond to turn into something else entirely. "Someone will find us," Aria said, her voice steady with effort. "Mom knows we should be home by now. She's probably already told the police." Maeve nodded but stayed silent. Somewhere in her thoughts, an image flickered. A black and tan German shepherd with upright ears and bright, watchful eyes trotting beside a man in uniform along White Hollow's main street. The memory made her heart beat faster, though she couldn't tell if it was hope or just a snowstorm dream. Outside, the sky had deepened into a heavy purple gray. The wind kept rising, shoving great curtains of snow through the air. Inside the cabin, the sisters huddled close beneath the worn wool blanket, listening to every sound the forest gave them. Each whistle, each rattle of the door, each subtle creak became something they strained to interpret, as if at any moment it might mean something was drawing near. The darkness inside was thick like a heavy curtain. The only light came from a small flashlight Aria had brought in her pack, its battery weak, casting a faint, wavering yellow glow across the weathered boards. The thin seams between the planks trembled with each gust, letting in needles of cold that cut straight across the cramped space they were trying to keep warm. Aria pulled the blanket tighter around Maeve's shoulders, then wrapped her arms around her sister. She could feel Maeve's body shivering in small, unsteady bursts, like a dry leaf caught in a restless breeze. Every breath Maeve took emerged as a faint puff of mist, vanishing the instant it touched the frigid air. "You okay?" Aria asked softly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile stillness. Maeve gave the smallest nod, but her blue-tinged lips and icy hands told the truth. The cold was sinking deeper with each passing minute. They sat pressed into a corner, away from the gaps, where the wind cut through the hardest. Beneath them, the wooden floorboards had rotted in places, exposing patches of frozen earth. Each time the wind wailed, it sent a crawling chill up through their boots until their toes ached as if locked in ice. Aria rummaged again through the pack they'd carried from music class. 2 biscuits remained along with a half-empty bottle. She broke 1 biscuit in 2, placing the larger half into Maeve's hand. "Eat. You need the strength." Maeve held it for a moment, letting its faint warmth soak into her palm before taking a careful bite. The soft crunch of chewing filled the quiet between them, joined only by the wind's constant cry outside. Aria shared the water, each of them taking only the smallest sip. The liquid was ice cold, sliding down their throats like a thin blade, yet it gave a fleeting freshness in the frozen air. She knew they had to make every crumb and drop last. There was no telling when help might arrive. While they ate, Aria swung the dim beam of her flashlight around the cabin in search of anything useful. In the far corner, she spotted a broken-legged chair under a layer of dust, and on the wall above it hung a faded winter coat still intact. She crossed, quickly shook off the dust, and draped it over Maeve's shoulders. "Better?" Aria asked. Maeve managed a faint smile, pulling the collar up to her chin before nodding. They tried to warm themselves by rubbing their hands together and pressing them against their cheeks. Aria briefly considered holding the flashlight for warmth, but the metal casing was already chilled solid. Even so, the light was precious. It pushed the darkness back just enough to create a small circle where they could feel safe. Outside, the storm hammered on. Heavy gusts slapped the roof with thick, wet snow, making a low, distant drumming. Now and then the whole cabin shivered as a wave of wind struck it, sending a fine dust of snow sifting down through the doorframe. The sound of the gale seemed to reach straight into their bones, stiffening their fingers and toes. Maeve leaned her head on Aria's shoulder, eyes half closed but unwilling to fully sleep, as if afraid the world might change while she wasn't looking. Aria began humming a tune they had practiced in class, her voice trembling but steady enough to weave into the wind. The melody was thin and fragile, yet it was something to hold on to, a thread of calm against the storm's chaos. After a while, Aria noticed the cold gnawing through every layer she wore, forcing her to shift and stretch to keep her blood moving. She urged Maeve to do the same, swinging her arms, flexing her legs, anything to keep from going numb. "I think it'll be morning soon," Aria murmured, her gaze fixed on the slit of light at the door where snow still swirled in pale ribbons. "Once it's light, it'll be easier for them to find us." Maeve gave a quiet in reply, though worry still pressed at the edges of her mind. The blizzard outside showed no sign of easing, and the cold was only sinking deeper. Yet the weak yellow glow of the flashlight, the worn wool blanket, and the steady warmth of her sister's arms were enough to keep her from letting go. The sound of the wind shifted, no longer the steady howl it had been, but threaded with something else faint and uncertain, like footsteps pressing into snow. Aria lifted her head, tilting her ear to listen. In an instant, the noise was swallowed again by the storm. She glanced at Maeve and saw the same alertness in her sister's eyes. Probably just a branch falling. Aria reassured, though somewhere inside her, a fragile spark of hope began to flicker. Out there, somewhere beyond the white void, a German shepherd was lowering its head to test the wind ear, standing tall, eyes fixed with steady resolve, as if it knew that someone was waiting for it in this cold. By late afternoon in White Hollow, the sky had surrendered entirely to the deep gray of the storm. Gusts battered the streets, spinning great swirls of snow across empty roads. In a small house on the edge of town, Evelyn, Aria and Maeve's mother, paced between the window and the clock on the wall. At first she'd thought the girls were lingering after music class to chat with friends. But when the clock edged towards 6 and the night swallowed the street outside when the wind began to shriek with real force. Worry tightened its grip. She called friends and neighbors, hoping someone had seen them on the way home. Every reply was the same: no one had. Her hands chilled as her mind conjured images of the two children lost in weather like this. She remembered a neighbor's warning that morning, that the weather could turn without mercy. Unease hardened into urgency. Evelyn reached for the phone and dialed the police station. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Aria and Maeve. My daughters. They haven't come home. They walked to music class this afternoon, and they're still not back. On the other end, the desk officer's tone was calm but brisk. He took down every detail: the time they'd left, what they were wearing, what they were carrying, the route they usually took. But when Evelyn mentioned their homemade sled, the one they often used to get home faster, the man's voice sharpened. In the duty room, Lieutenant Caleb Rowan was reviewing a rescue report from the previous week when a sharp call cut through the quiet. Rowan missing persons. 2 young girls possibly caught outside in the snowstorm. He set the file down at once and crossed the room in long strides. As the details unfolded, Caleb pictured the danger: plunging temperatures, blinding wind, snow so heavy it could rob a child of their bearings in minutes. If Aria and Maeve had veered off the main road into the forest, the search would be far more complicated. A glance at the wall clock told him they had little time to spare. He headed for the equipment room, pulling on storm gear piece by piece. Fur-lined jacket, windproof trousers, rubber-soled boots, thick gloves, insulated hood. Each motion swift but deliberate, a practiced rhythm honed over years of rescues. Beside him, Aster had already sensed the change in atmosphere. The German shepherd stood by the door, ears sharp, eyes bright with focus. Caleb bent to pat his shoulder. My friend, tonight's going to be a long one. We need to find those girls before the cold does. He buckled Aster into his high-visibility harness, fastening a small light at the collar. A compact pack was secured across the dog's back, stocked with dry food, water, medical gauze, and a folded rescue blanket. Back in the main room, Caleb accepted a radio and a topographical map of the eastern forest, where the girls might have strayed. Winds shifting southeast, a colleague warned. Watch the slope by the creek. Snow's deep there. Caleb nodded. He knew the place. A maze of abandoned trails, some leading to old hunters' cabins. In a storm like this, such a cabin could mean shelter, but only if they found the right one in time. Stepping into the station yard, the cold hit him full in the face, snowflakes clinging to his collar and hood. He zipped his jacket high and drew a breath that crystallized in the air. Aster padded beside him, leaving deep, deliberate prints in the snow. The search vehicle's engine was already running headlights, cutting narrow beams through the swirling white. Caleb opened the door and Aster leapt into the back, circling once before sitting poised. Before they set off, Caleb keyed his radio. Rowan here. Deploying to Eastern Forest, White Hollow. Target 2 girls, Aria and Maeve, age 8, matching description in report. A voice crackled back. Copy. Good luck. Check in every 10 minutes. The vehicle rolled out, tires hissing over the snow. In the dim cabin light, Caleb glanced back at Aster, who sat watching the dark beyond the glass, as if memorizing the scent of the storm. At the town's edge, Caleb slowed. Visibility had dropped to mere yards. He chose to stop at a safe turnout, continuing on foot so Aster could work. The dog's collar light blinked on, casting a small circle of gold ahead. Team Aster. Find the girls. The German shepherd inhaled deeply, then began to move paws steady in the drifts, nose low to the ground. Caleb kept close, the cold biting through every layer. The wind screamed in his ears, but through it all, he could hear one sound with perfect clarity. Aster's paws crunching in the snow even, and certain like a promise they would not come back empty-handed. The steel door of the White Hollow station shut behind them, and Caleb pulled his hood tight as they stepped into the storm. Ice-laced wind struck his face like needles, each step heavier than the last. He had worked in worse conditions before, but this time was different. Somewhere out here in the heart of the blizzard, two young lives were waiting for him and Aster to reach them. The dog kept close at his side, his thick black and gold coat shivering with the gusts. The harness straps were secure reflective strips gleaming in the light. At his flanks, the small side packs carried gauze, a spare flashlight, dry rations, and a foil emergency blanket. Caleb gave the lead a firm squeeze, a silent pact between man and dog as they stepped forward into the white. Caleb's gear was chosen with precision. A fur-lined inner jacket sealed beneath a windproof, snow-repellent outer shell. Reinforced trousers fused into high-topped boots, insulated gloves, and a hood drawn tight to keep the heat in without narrowing his field of vision. On his shoulders rested a rescue pack stocked with maps, a GPS, a radio, medical supplies, spare batteries, and several energy bars to fuel hours of non-stop movement. At his belt hung a multi-tool and a heavy-duty flashlight ready for whatever the night might bring. The storm had grown wilder than forecast. Above, black clouds rolled like massive waves, swallowing the last scraps of daylight. Street lamps along the main road glowed weakly, their halos quickly consumed by swirling snow. When Caleb and Aster reached the northern junction, he saw other patrol vehicles blocking the road. A fellow officer stepped forward, scarf muffling his voice. "Roads closed. Snow's coming down from the slope, winds too strong. Nothing can get through." Caleb glanced toward the drifted barricade. Snow mounded chest high, shifting under the wind's shove like living walls. His grip on the pack straps tightened. A roadblock meant a longer, harder route, but also the only way into the eastern forest where Aria and Maeve might be stranded. "I'll cut through the south trail," he replied, his voice firm. The officer only nodded, knowing that with Aster at his side, Caleb stood the best chance of finding the girls. They left the main road for a narrow track skirting the forest's edge. The wind eased slightly here, but the snow was so deep each step sank nearly to the tops of Caleb's boots. Aster moved ahead, the small light on his collar, casting a mobile halo across frost-glazed branches and shimmering ice. Caleb kept one eye on his GPS, though the signal wavered, sometimes vanishing entirely when gusts tore through the treetops. He relied as much on his memory and the paper map tucked inside his jacket, stopping now and then to check bearings. Each pause found Aster's still and silent ears tuned to the wind, drawing in deep breaths as if committing every scent to memory. The deeper they went, the more urgent Caleb felt, the clock pressing against them. He could see the girls in his mind, huddled against the cold, the dark closing in. He knew well the limits of a child's endurance in weather like this, and that window was closing. A sudden gust ripped through the canopy, sending a cascade of snow from an old branch like a burst of white water. Caleb shielded his face and bent his knees against the force. Aster stepped back to press against his leg eyes, questioning. Caleb's hand found the dog's head, giving a brief, steady pat. The trail sloped downward into a small valley. Beneath the snow-hidden stones and twisted roots made every step a hazard. Caleb chose each placement carefully. Aster leapt lightly over obstacles, pausing now and then to let his partner catch up. They moved together with a rhythm born of countless past searches. At the base of the slope, Caleb keyed his radio. Rowan off the main road, approaching southeast via the South Trail. "Will report every 10 minutes. Static hissed, then a reply. "Copy. Stay safe." As he stowed the radio, Aster's head suddenly swung east, ears snapping upright. Caleb recognized the signal. The dog had caught a trace of scent. Without a word, he eased the lead forward, letting Aster take point. The storm still raged, snow stinging his cheeks, but man and dog cut a determined path, a slender line of light threading through the darkness. Somewhere ahead, perhaps only miles away, two children were holding on to a fragile thread of hope, the very one Caleb and Aster carried with them. They angled onto a new course. The wind shifted again, brushing a faint scent across the trail. Aster's eyes brightened and his pace quickened. The dog lowered his head almost to the snow, drawing in breath after breath, his nose sifting for the source. Caleb knew his own vision was next to useless in the blizzard, but Aster's senses could catch what the storm tried to bury. A sharp crosswind carried another wisp of scent. Aster froze mid-step, muscles taut, then veered toward the northeast, a direction Caleb's map marked as leading to the old hunter's cabins. "All right, Aster," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady. "Lead the way." Snow rose higher with every yard, in places brushing Caleb's knees. He stepped in Aster's tracks to conserve energy, keeping their tether close. When the gusts grew so fierce, he had to hunch low. The dog pressed on, without faltering, the reflective strips on his harness gleaming like sparks in the white haze. Suddenly, Aster stopped and nosed at a shallow depression in the snow. Caleb knelt, brushing it clear with his glove. The faint curve of a small boot print emerged from beneath the crust, partly blurred by fresh snowfall, but unmistakable. A thread of heat coiled in Caleb's chest. "Good work, Aster," he murmured, rubbing the dog's neck. Aster lifted his head, as if he understood, then forged on, weaving between narrow side paths and returning each time to the main line of scent. Caleb followed, marking their trail on both GPS and paper map. In a storm like this, a single wrong turn could erase every chance they had, and he wasn't about to let that happen. About an hour had passed when the signs on the snow grew more frequent. Faint drag marks, perhaps from the girl's sled, and a small scrap of blue cloth caught in the wind, snagged on a low pine branch. Caleb picked it free, recognizing instantly the color of the scarf Evelyn had described. Aster seemed to recognize it too. The German shepherd let out a low whine, then surged forward, forcing Caleb to lengthen his stride to keep pace, his heartbeat quickening from both the effort and the sudden conviction that they were closer than ever. The wind tore harder at them now, but Aster's determination never faltered. At every fork in the trail he stopped, inhaled deeply several times, and then chose a direction with calm certainty. Caleb never intervened. His trust in his partner was absolute. From past rescues, he knew that Aster's nose could find what the eye would never catch in a snowstorm. At last they broke into a thinner stand of trees. In the center lay a series of fresh depressions, as if someone had passed through only moments before. Aster lowered his head, drawing in a long, deep breath, then lifted his gaze to Caleb, eyes bright against the blizzard's white. Caleb understood at once. The scent was fresh, and the girls were very near. "Well done, my friend," he murmured, giving the lead a reassuring squeeze. "We're almost there." Aster veered left, guiding him through a narrow gap between two ice-crusted boulders. Here the wind dropped the rocks, breaking the gale, and beyond lay a small hollow. Caleb's eyes caught a faint outline, the sagging roof of an old wooden cabin. His pulse quickened, a rush of hope mingling with tension. Hope, because this could be where Aria and Maeve had taken shelter. Tension, because inside could mean anything. The wind moaned behind them, as though urging them onward. Aster stood at the cabin door now, nose pressed to the weathered wood, one paw scratching lightly. Caleb came up beside him, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the living heat beneath the thick coat, the heat of loyalty and perseverance that had carried them this far. Inside, the darkness hung heavy like a thick blanket, pressing down on every object. The only light came from a small dying flashlight, its dim yellow glow spilling over cracked wooden walls where the cold hissed in through every gap. Outside, the storm screamed against the structure, making the whole frame tremble. Aria huddled in her thin coat arms, wrapped tight around her sister. Their breaths rose in fragile clouds that dissolved into the shadows. Maeve leaned against her shoulder, eyes wide but glazing with the pull of cold and exhaustion. Aria felt her sister's hand, stiff now, The fingers blanched toward blue. "Hey." Aria's voice shook as she gave a gentle nudge. "Talk to me, okay? Don't close your eyes too long." Maeve blinked and managed a faint smile. "I'm listening. Tell me something." Aria bit her lip, pushing the fear down. "Remember when we practiced River's song for the school concert? You missed a few notes, but it turned into a new melody, and everyone laughed." Maeve gave a breath of laughter thin as the wind. "Yeah. And you said music doesn't have to be perfect as long as it brings joy." The wind's whistle seeped through the timber, blending with their voices. Aria went on telling of the summer day they'd gone with their mother to the riverbank, tossing smooth stones into the water to see which made the most ripples. Maeve closed her eyes, as though seeing it again. The sky a deep, endless blue, the water glittering, their laughter ringing between the silver circles on the surface. The cold still crept through the cabin, stealing warmth inch by inch. Aria tightened her hold, counting every shallow breath. She knew that if silence claimed them, the pull of sleep could become something they'd never wake from. "You know," she whispered cheek against her sister's chilled hair, "when we're grown, you'll play piano better than me. We'll perform together in the White Hollow Square. People will set out long benches, and Aster will sit in the front row to listen." Maeve's eyes sparked with a trace of warmth. "You think that dog will sit still for us?" "I'm sure he will." Aria replied, her tone firmer now. "Because he understands music. Just like he understands us." A sudden blast rattled the cabin walls, the flashlight flickering before dimming further, leaving only the faint reflection of snow through the small window. Aria drew Maeve closer, weaving more little stories. Their first day at school, the first cake they baked by themselves, dreams of seeing places with snow more beautiful than White Hollow. Each memory was a thin thread binding Maeve to wakefulness, keeping the pull of unconsciousness at bay. Aria kept speaking, determined not to let silence win. "Do you think?" Maeve's voice was barely a murmur. "Someone's looking for us?" Aria swallowed her answer, steady. "Yes, absolutely. Maybe Caleb's already on his way. And Aster, too." At the sound of the dog's name, a spark lit in the darkness. Maeve nodded, faintly picturing him. Strong and sure-footed eyes cutting through the snow like a promise to find them. Outside, the wind still howled, but beneath it, Aria thought she heard something else. Faint, like footsteps pressing into hardened snow. She couldn't be sure if it was real or just hope whispering in her own ears. Still, she kept talking because in her heart, she believed if they held on to hope, any sound could become the herald of rescue. The wind barreled down from the mountainside, driving whirling snow into a blinding haze. Caleb hunched low to shield his vision from the ice-sharp sting of the gale. Ahead, Aster forged on tail, like an arrow pointed toward their goal. Then the dinks stopped dead. Ears snapped upright, body lowered, locked on one spot. Caleb closed the distance. Beneath a layer of fresh snow snagged on a low pine branch was a small piece of blue cloth, its frayed edge dusted with crystals of ice. Caleb knelt, brushing away the fresh snow with a gloved hand. The moment his fingers touched the frozen scrap of fabric, he recognized it instantly. The exact shade Evelyn, mother of Aria and Maeve, had described when she'd reported them missing. It might have torn from the scarf, wrapped around Aria's neck, or from the hem of her coat when the wind had dragged them along. "Good work, Aster," Caleb said, his voice low, but his eyes lit with a mix of relief and sharpened focus. Aster leaned forward, drawing in the scent deeply, before lifting his head toward the northeast, golden eyes locking on the unseen. Caleb understood. The wind from that direction carried the girl's scent fresh enough to mean they weren't far. He unfolded his paper map, marking the spot. Compared to their intended route, they were now just over a kilometer from the cluster of abandoned hunting cabins. In calmer weather, it would have been a short trek. In this, it was a gauntlet, up to the knees, fallen trees blocking the way, wind whipping without pause. Caleb tightened his grip on the lead eyes, following the direction Aster had chosen. "Let's move, my friend. We're close now." The German shepherd pushed forward without hesitation, cutting through the gusts like an arrow. Every so often he stopped, sniffed the air to confirm, then pressed on. Caleb kept pace, his pulse quickening each time they stumbled across a new trace, the faint rounded impression of a small boot, the long dragline of a sled. Each time Caleb scraped away snow to confirm, giving a brief nod when he found what he hoped for. In his mind, the picture of the two girls huddled in the cold was sharp and urgent. Every second that passed meant more of their warmth was being drained away. Near the base of a gradual slope, Aster suddenly veered left, darting toward a narrow trail nearly buried under drifts. Caleb followed hard, breaking through a sparse patch of trees until he spotted it. A dark streak in the snow, as if someone had fallen here before rising again. Nearby, a crust of bread lay half buried, its edge dusted white. "They're close," he told himself, part to steady his breathing, part to push himself faster. Aster barked once, short-clipped, not a warning, but a declaration. Caleb knew that bark. It meant the trail was no longer just a possibility. He surged forward, vaulting fallen trunks, the storm around him fading into the background against the single urgency of arriving in time. Then through the white haze, a dark shape took form. The slanted roof of a wooden cabin, snow piled high. Caleb's muscles tightened instinctively. He signaled Aster to slow eyes scanning the area for hazards. The closer they came, the clearer the structure appeared. Old and listing, but solid enough to shield someone from the worst of the storm. Aster reached the door first, nose pressed to the gap, breathing in. His ears flicked. Then he looked back at Caleb, eyes burning with confirmation. The scent matched the blue scrap Caleb still held. His heart thudded. They were standing at the threshold between despair and hope. One more step, and he'd know if the girls had enough strength left to be brought out. Caleb crouched beside Aster, hand on the dog's back, speaking as he would to any seasoned partner. "Ready tonight? We bring them home." Outside, the wind's voice changed. It wasn't just the long, steady wail anymore. There was a new note in it, dry and sharp like wood splintering under strain. Inside Aria's head, snapped up her hand, tightening instinctively on Maeve's shoulder. "You!" Hear that Maeve whispered, her voice trembling. Aria nodded. Above them came the crack of something giving way, each sound longer, more insistent. The old cabin seemed to groan under the weight of snow and wind. Each time a gust slammed across the roof, the rafters shuddered and a dusting of snow sifted down to the frozen floor. Outside, the blizzard was peaking. Winds whipped the drifts into spinning walls of white between the bare trees. Trunks swayed under the force, some thick enough to wrench free from the ground, entirely roots tearing up soil and vanishing into the storm. Through a gap in the wall, Aria saw it. A massive blackened pine split halfway through, swaying on the last fibers of rotten wood. Every blast of wind sent it lurching toward the cabin like an enormous arm poised to strike. "Maeve, closer," Aria said, voice steady now. She pulled her sister toward a corner that felt less exposed. A sharp crack split the air above, making both girls flinch. One of the roof beams had given way, loosening the join so that snow now poured down in heavy clumps. The cold bit deeper with every icy fall, soaking into their coats. Outside, Caleb pressed his ear to the wall, hearing each fracture as if the building itself was speaking. Time was slipping away. If a tree came down or the roof took more weight, the cabin wouldn't last. He met Aster's gaze. The dog was rigid by the door ears, fixed, every muscle alert. "Get ready," Caleb murmured, stepping back to judge the safest point of entry. The wind screamed suddenly, carrying the final brutal snap of the old pine giving way. The crash thundered through the forest, the impact quivering up through the frozen ground. Inside, Aria and Maeve clung to each other, the world outside collapsing toward them. The giant tree tilted down its crown, now only a few feet from the roof. A beam tore free entirely, opening a gap where the gale poured in. The left wall began to bow inward. One more strike, and the cabin would be undone. Caleb tightened the straps on his pack, eyes narrowing. He pulled a pry bar from the holster at his hip and crouched low, waiting for the instant to move. Aster gave a sharp, urgent bark, the kind that brooked no doubt. The dog's instincts had never failed him, and Caleb knew they wouldn't now. Inside, Aria tried to steady her little sister by squeezing her hand and repeating, "It's going to be all right, Maeve. It's going to be all right." But even she could hear the rapid pounding of her own heartbeat. A fierce gust slammed across the roof, followed by the final splintering crack of the sagging beam. Caleb didn't hesitate. Now, inside, he shouted over the storm, then lunged forward, throwing his full weight against the rotting door. Wind and snow burst in at once, sweeping a cloud of white dust into the dim air. Aster charged ahead, golden eyes scanning the shadows before locking onto two small figures huddled in the far corner. The storm roared through the trees, flinging snow like 1,000 white needles at the earth. Amid the chaos, Caleb froze. He had just heard something, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. Thin, broken, but urgent. It was a cry. Weak, nearly lost, but enough to awaken every instinct of a rescuer. He straightened, holding his breath. This time it came clearer, trembling and unmistakably a child's voice. "Help!" The word was swallowed halfway by the gale before dissolving into the white void. "Maeve?" Caleb murmured, remembering the girl's face from the family photo he'd seen at the station. Beside him, Aster reacted instantly. Ears shot forward, muscles taut. A second later, he bolted ahead like an arrow, leaving a trail of deep prints in the snow. Caleb gripped the leash tight, pushing to keep up. The wind slashed at their faces, cutting visibility to mere meters. But Aster pressed on, nose close to the snow, drawing in deep breaths, until he suddenly veered left into a faint path almost erased by the drifts. Without him, Caleb knew he would never have found it. Every trace of the trail was buried, leaving only subtle dips in the snow, marks no untrained eye could read. "Good work, my friend," he said, between breaths, voice steady despite the storm. They plunged into the narrow path, like threading a maze of white. On either side, the trees bent under the weight of snow and wind, shedding heavy clumps that thudded into the ground. Every sound echoed through the forest, and Caleb knew that one falling tree in the wrong place could seal their way out. The cry rang again, clearer now, laced with sobs. They were close. Caleb signaled for Aster to pick up the pace, and the dog responded at once. Powerful legs driving through the snow breath, bursting out in quick clouds. Suddenly, Aster halted. He lifted his head, golden eyes flashing in the storm, toward a faint outline of a snow-laden roof ahead. Caleb closed the gap, heart pounding. It was the abandoned cabin marked on the map. Outside the door, wind spiraled in miniature blizzards, battering the wood until it shuddered. Caleb stepped forward, pressing his ear to the rotting boards. Inside, ragged breaths broken by the choked voice of a child calling for someone. Aria and Maeve's voice came again, hoarse and frayed, more a strained whisper than a shout. Caleb looked at Aster. They needed no words. Every second mattered. Another gust slammed the cabin, groaning the roof beams. He stepped back, gripping the breaching tool. "Ready, Aster. We're bringing them out." The dog gave a low rumble, not of menace, but of certainty. Caleb tightened the straps of his pack and took a deep breath. The storm raged, but beneath the howl of the wind, he felt a single rhythm. one heartbeat shared between rescuer and canine partner, moving as one toward the decisive moment. Snow and ice pelted the walls like fists. Caleb braced before the door, feeling every tremor of the strained timbers. He drew in one last breath, then drove the tool forward with all his strength. Crash. The warped wood split, fragments scattering into the gloom. Wind and snow surged in scattering pale dust from the rafters. Caleb stepped inside, sweeping his beam across the space. In the farthest corner, two small figures curled together beneath a thin scarf. Aria clutched Maeve tightly, both shaking lips tinged blue. Aria's wide eyes brimmed with shock and fear, while Maeve seemed to cling only to her sister's warmth for strength. Aria Maeve Caleb's voice was low but warm, bridging the gap between them and the outside world. Aster moved forward, paws silent on the powder-dusted floor. He lowered himself beside the girls, touching his nose gently to Aria's icy hand. Warm breath steamed between them, drawing her gaze upward to meet eyes of deep gold, steady and trusting. Caleb knelt quickly, assessing their condition. The touch of Maeve's chilled skin made his chest tighten. They had been out here far too long. "We're leaving now. You've done so well." His words were slow and firm, feeding them strength. Aster stayed close, his broad frame shielding them from the draft slipping through the walls. His gaze never left Caleb, ready for the next command. Caleb pulled two silver thermal blankets from his pack, wrapping them snugly around the sisters, covering their heads and necks, then slipped a hand warmer into each of their palms. Aster bent lower, letting Maeve press her tiny fingers into the thick fur, drawing every drop of warmth it held. Outside, the storm still roared. But inside the cabin, something else had arrived. An ember of safety carried in by the man and his steadfast dog. Aria looked up, her voice hoarse yet clear. "I knew someone would find us." Caleb placed a steady hand on her shoulder and nodded. "And now we're going home. Together." Aster tilted his head, letting out a low huff as if in agreement. The dog stepped back half a pace, making room for Caleb to guide the girls out of the tent. But at that moment, a sharp, cracking sound split the air above them, followed by the screech of wooden nails tearing free. The entire tent shuddered. Caleb knew they had minutes, maybe only seconds, before the storm claimed their shelter. Tightening the straps of his pack, he glanced toward the door, then back at Aster. "Let's go, my friend. Stay close to them." And in the heart of a storm that threatened to swallow everything, three human silhouettes, a man, two young girls, and one steadfast German shepherd, began their escape from danger, carrying with them a fragile but burning spark of hope. The sound came almost instantly after Caleb helped Aria and Maeve to their feet. A thunderous crash as a massive sheet of snow, pressed and hardened by hours of wind, broke free from the roof and buried the front entrance in a wall of ice and white. Caleb lunged forward, shoulders slamming into it, but the packed snow didn't yield. It had frozen into a solid, unmovable barricade. Turning back, his eyes swept the dim interior, searching for any other way out. Aster let out a low growl, ears pricking toward the small side window. Caleb followed his gaze, and his stomach tightened. Through the frost-streaked glass, he saw the dark silhouette of a massive tree leaning heavily toward them. Its roots were half ripped from the ground, holding on by only a few thick strands. With every howl of the wind, the trunk tilted further, its crown aimed like a spear at their roof. "This isn't good," Caleb murmured. Outside, the wind had become a constant roar, branches snapping and clattering onto the roof like a warning drumbeat. Maeve clung to Aria, eyes wide and brimming. "Sister, that tree." Aria pulled her close, shielding her view, though her own throat tightened at the sight. Caleb made his choice in an instant. Aster, find another way out. The shepherd lowered his head, circling the tent nose pressed to the floor and walls. He stopped at a far corner where the wood was softer and the snow outside thinner. Digging furiously, he turned to Caleb with a sharp glance, his signal. The deep rumble of tearing roots shook the ground. The tree had only seconds left before it fell. Caleb moved Aria and Maeve beside Aster. Stay with him. Don't let go. His voice was firm but calm. He pulled a rescue axe from his pack and swung with all his strength into the rotted wood. Each strike thudded, splinters flying and cold air slashing in through the widening gap. The tree began its final descent with a sound like a giant's drumbeat rolling through the forest. Faster, Caleb urged himself, hacking at the last slat. Finally, the opening was big enough for Aster to push through. The shepherd bounded into the snow, spun, and barked sharply, urging them on. Caleb scooped Maeve into his arms, Aria gripping his back, and together they lunged through the hole. The moment they cleared it, the tree crashed down, splintering the roof and swallowing the space they had stood in moments before. The blizzard still raged, but at least they were out of immediate danger. Caleb tightened his pack straps, determination in his eyes. Let's move. We'll get out of this. Aster took the lead, his back dusted in snow breath, steaming in the frozen air. They had barely cleared the wall of the tent when the rending roar of wood filled the air, the giant tree ripping free from the earth. Time slowed. Its massive bulk tilted toward them, branches like skeletal arms reaching to strike. Caleb turned instinctively, clutching Maeve to shield her. Aria, standing just a few steps away, froze, her eyes locked on the dark mass bearing down on them. Aster braced against the wind, spotted the danger instantly. His amber eyes flared against the snow's haze. Without hesitation, he lunged for Aria, jaws closing around her coat sleeve. One savage yank sent her stumbling backward, sliding across the snow. Aster, Caleb shouted, though his voice was nearly swallowed by the storm and the cracking wood. He could still see the shepherd's fierce, deliberate movements, pulling her clear with every ounce of his strength. A split second after Aria was yanked aside, a massive branch sheared off and slammed into the snow where she had stood. The impact sent up a white spray, the ground shivering beneath them. Maeve screamed and buried her face in Caleb's coat. He turned quickly toward Aria, kneeling in the snow chest, heaving her sleeve still in Aster's jaws. The dog released her, stepping in front, as if to block the wind and any further threat. Caleb knelt, hand on Aria's shoulder. You okay? She swallowed hard, nodding shakily. If Aster hadn't pulled me. She trailed off, but they all knew how that sentence would have ended. Caleb gave a small nod, then met Aster's gaze. Good work, my friend. The shepherd lifted his head in quiet acknowledgement, then turned back toward the storm, ready to lead them onward. The blizzard still roared on, hurling ice-hard snow into their faces and stinging their eyes. Yet in every heart burned a renewed spark of life, kindled by Aster's brave act. Caleb knew they couldn't stop now. The storm was far from over, and every second of standing still could turn into disaster. He tightened the straps of his backpack, adjusted the thermal blanket around the two girls, and signaled, Let's move. Aster, lead the way. The German shepherd stepped forward instantly, his powerful paws pressing deep into the snow, leaving a narrow trail for Aria and Maeve to follow. Each stride seemed more resolute than the last, as if the danger moments ago had only deepened his determination to guide them out of harm's reach. Behind them, the sound of breaking timber echoed through the storm, but they no longer looked back. Ahead was all that mattered now. A path carved through the blinding white, opened by Aster's steps and the group's unyielding will. The wind howled, whipping the snow into spiraling dragons that swirled around the cabin. Part of the roof had already collapsed, Splintered beams creaked under the storm's relentless force, and the front door was buried beneath a wall of ice and snow. There was no hope of escape from that direction. Caleb's eyes swept the inside of the cabin, counting each second, as if an invisible hand was squeezing time itself. They had to get out before the walls gave way completely. Aster stood a few paces away, ears erect, nose twitching in the icy air. Suddenly he turned sharply toward the back wall, where faint daylight filtered through gaps between the planks. He moved closer, pressing his nose against the wood, sniffing deeply before scratching at the floor with rapid, urgent strokes. "What is it?" Aster Caleb hurried over. He saw a rotted plank, dark and warped with age. Whenever a gust of wind hit it, trembled slightly, widening the gap at its edge. Through it, Caleb glimpsed the dim chaos outside, and more importantly, a space just large enough to form a way out. Without hesitation, he set Maeve down and told Aria to hold her tight. "Stay together. Don't move." He stepped back, braced himself, and slammed his boot into the plank. The wood shuddered, but held. Aster gave a low, encouraging rumble. Caleb inhaled deeply, put all his strength into a second kick. This time, the plank split with a sharp crack, and a large section burst outward, revealing an opening wide enough for an adult to crawl through. A blast of icy wind rushed in, biting their faces, but with it came a rush of relief. They had a way out. Caleb turned to Aster. "Go first. Check it." The dog slipped through the gap and vanished into the swirling white. Seconds later, a clear, steady bark rang out, a signal of safety. Caleb helped Aria push Maeve through first. As soon as they were outside, the cabin groaned ominously, and a heavy beam crashed down exactly where they had been standing. No time to waste. Caleb ducked through the opening, the cold slicing into his lungs. Outside, Aster stood as a windbreak for the girls, eyes fixed on the forest ahead, the path forward. He gathered the group quickly, propped the broken plank against the hole to slow the snow from pouring in, and turned his back on the cabin. It swayed and moaned under the wind's weight, now only a fragile memory of how close they had come to disaster. Caleb rested a hand on Aster's head. "Good work. We owe this to you." The German shepherd didn't look at him, just tilted his head slightly before pressing on, cutting a path through the storm. Caleb knew more trials lay ahead, but they had survived one gate where even a few seconds' delay would have ended everything. The wind shrieked like 1,000 horns, wrapping their bodies in sheets of ice-cold air. The moment they stepped away from the cabin, the storm's force shoved Caleb sideways. Snow pelted his face, leaving sharp, stinging trails across skin reddened by cold. Aster forged ahead, his sturdy frame a dark, moving beacon against the white void. His thick coat was heavy with snow, but his pace remained strong and certain. Now and then he glanced back, golden eyes glowing like twin embers, checking to ensure Aria and Maeve were still close. Caleb kept between them, far enough forward to shield the girls from sudden gusts, yet close enough to follow Aster's lead. The icy flakes slipped down his collar, sliding along his spine, but his resolve burned hotter than any frost. "Stay close," he shouted through the roar, his voice almost swallowed by the gale. Aria clutched Maeve head down against the snow, her small feet landing exactly where Caleb's had pressed the path firm, avoiding deep drifts. Aster halted in a small clearing, nose lifted high to scent the air, then veered right. Caleb quickly understood. Aster was avoiding danger. Ahead, a massive tree leaned at an angle, its largest branch thrashing wildly, ready to break at any moment. They followed his detour, weaving through slimmer, sturdier trees. The wind moaned through the canopy like ocean waves crashing against unseen cliffs. Every time a sudden gust struck, Caleb spread his arms to shield the girls, while Aster wheeled back to guard from the front, gaze steady and unwavering. Each step forward was its own battle. The snow reached Caleb's shins, clinging like frozen weights. But in the heart of the blizzard, They clung to the sight of Aster's determined stride and the rhythmic sound of his breathing, their one clear sign that safety was drawing nearer. A sudden gust of wind swept through, shaking the snow-laden branches until the heavy white dropped all at once, cascading down like a massive curtain. Maeve stumbled with a sharp sniffle, nearly losing her balance, but Aria caught her just in time. Caleb bent low, scooping both girls into his arms, trudging forward through the snow-buried path. Ahead of them, Aster stood waiting, pawing at the ground, as if urging them to hurry. At last, through the dense, suffocating white, a thinner stretch of forest appeared. The wind no longer screamed quite so fiercely, replaced by distant sounds, perhaps rushing water or something swaying against the wind. Caleb knew they had come far, but the path ahead was still uncertain. He stepped up beside Aster, resting a gloved hand on the dog's neck. "You've done well, but we have to keep going." Aster's ears dipped slightly as though in understanding, and he surged forward again, carving a new trail through the endless sea of snow. Behind him, Aria tightened her grip on her sister's hand, eyes fixed on Aster's strong frame, the one unwavering beacon in the storm's darkness. They pressed on each step, leaving deep footprints that stretched into a long, unbroken line through the howling white. The wind still sliced through the trees, but then faintly on the horizon, a light appeared. At first, it was no more than a speck, like a lone star fallen to earth, flickering between waves of snow. But with every step, the glow grew sharper, pulsing as if calling them forward. Caleb paused, narrowing his eyes. His heart thudded in his chest. It wasn't the trick of cold or exhaustion. It was a rescue light. "Aria. Do you see it?" he shouted over the wind. Aria, steadying Maeve, lifted her head. Her eyes widened, her voice breaking with emotion. "I see it. The light." But the joy barely had time to take root before Caleb noticed Maeve slowing. Her breaths came in short, uneven puffs, her lips turning a pale purple. Her small steps faltered. "Stop for a moment," Caleb called out immediately, bending to lift her into his arms. She was so light that he could feel every shiver trembling down from her shoulders. Aster had already turned back, pressing close to Aria's side. His golden eyes held a depth of knowing, and he stayed tight against her, forming a living wall against the wind. Whenever the snow whipped toward them, Aster shifted his body, shielding her completely, before glancing back toward the light, as if to remind them that hope was just ahead. Caleb adjusted his breathing, holding Maeve tighter, her wet icy hair clinging to his chest. He spoke half to himself, half to them all. "We're going to make it." The next steps felt heavy as stone, but the light grew larger, tearing through the storm. The trees began to thin the ground more open, and the wind eased just enough for them to hear the low, steady hum of an engine. Aria leaned toward Caleb, her voice small but determined. "We're close, right?" "Yes, closer than ever," Caleb replied, his gaze locked on the glow. "Just a little more." Aster quickened his pace, striking the snow in steady, powerful beats. Now and then, he stopped, glancing back to count heads before forging ahead. Soon the hazy outline of a rescue truck came into view, headlights cutting through the snowfall, sweeping long arcs of light over the white. Caleb's heart pounded faster, warmth spreading through him at the sight. In his arms, Maeve stirred, her half-lidded eyes fluttering open. Her voice was faint but clear. "I see. The light." Caleb looked down, smiling, despite the sting of frozen lips. "Yes, Maeve. We're almost home." Aster stayed right beside Aria, his golden eyes reflecting the rescue lights like a small, steady flame, the same light that had carried them this far. They stepped closer and closer until the light was no longer a distant speck, but the open arms of safety. The rescue truck stood solid against the blizzard headlights, still cutting through the night. The back doors swung open, and two rescuers in thick orange jackets leapt down, boots sinking into the snow. "Here, over here!" Caleb shouted, his raised arm and unwavering gaze guiding them through the storm. They rushed forward, taking Aria and Maeve's weight, helping Caleb onto the truck while he still held Maeve close. Aster followed without hesitation, his sturdy legs carrying him through the snow, his fur clumped with ice. Inside, the warmth hit instantly. The air fogged with heat as thick blankets were wrapped around Aria and Maeve's thin, trembling bodies. Caleb took one too, but kept his focus on the girls, checking their faces. Aria clung to Aster, burying her face in his warm fur. Tears spilled hot against her flushed cheeks. Maeve hugged Aster from the other side, her small arms clutching tight as if letting go might bring the storm back. "Thank you." Aria's voice broke on the words. Aster didn't understand them as humans do, but his golden eyes softened, and he lowered his head between the sisters, his warm breath fanning over their cold skin. It was his silent promise that they were safe now. Caleb settled beside them, his hand resting gently on Aria's shoulder. "You're safe. We're going home." The engine rumbled, the truck rolling forward. Outside, the world was still swallowed in snow, the wind howling in the distance. But inside, the warmth and the golden light made everything slow, wrapping them in a fragile, hard-earned peace. A rescue worker handed Caleb a steaming cup of herbal tea, the fragrant steam curling into the air. He took a slow sip before passing it to Aria. The girl glanced at Maeve, and when her younger sister gave the faintest nod, they both took small, careful sips, letting the warmth seep slowly into their cores. Aster lay close beside them, his head resting gently on Maeve's lap, eyes never leaving the girls. Each time the truck jolted over a rough patch in the road, he lifted his head, checking to see if they were still all right. Caleb leaned back against the seat with a deep exhale, feeling the weight of the long search finally begin to lift. He looked at Aster and gave a faint smile. "You're the real hero of tonight." The truck pushed on toward the glow of the town ahead, the street lamps gradually appearing as faint halos through the snowy haze. That light felt like a rope pulling them out of the hardest hours, drawing them back toward the arms of safety. Aria still clung to Aster, her cheek pressed into his thick fur, whispering something only she and the dog could ever understand. Maeve's eyes had closed, her breathing steady now, but her small hand remained wrapped tightly around Aster's neck. In that moment, Caleb knew this rescue was more than a successful mission. It was a bond. Between two sisters, a man and a brave dog, a story that would be told again and again in White Hollow whenever winter returned. As the truck turned into the town square, warm light from the windows spilled inside, chasing away the last traces of the storm clinging to their clothes. The people of White Hollow had gathered since the first news broke, standing shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in thin clouds in the frosty air. When the doors swung open, the square fell silent for one heartbeat, then erupted in cheers and choked sobs. Aria and Maeve, still wrapped in blankets, were lifted down into the arms of their parents. Their mother clutched them tight, hot tears falling into hair still damp with snow. Their father placed a trembling hand on their backs, as if to make sure this wasn't some fragile dream. Voices called their names. Congratulations filled the square, and neighbors reached out to grip Caleb's shoulder or shake his hand firmly. But Caleb only smiled, his gaze drifting to Aster, standing quietly beside him, ears high, eyes locked on Aria and Maeve. When the crowd gathered around the reunited family, Caleb stepped toward Aster. Kneeling in the snow, his gloved hands sank into the damp thickness of the dog's fur. Aster dipped his head to accept the touch, releasing a slow breath, his golden eyes catching the square's warm light. "Thank you, Aster," Caleb murmured, his voice low, blending with the softened night wind. "Tonight, without you, things might have been different." Aster nudged his head into Caleb's palm, then lifted it again as though listening to every word. In that look, Caleb saw everything. Loyalty, courage, and the calm of a soul long accustomed to walking the fine line between life and death. From far off the church bells rang, mingling with the now gentle wind, a sign that the storm was leaving the valley. White Hollow, after its long night of tension, settled once more into the warmth of reunion and peace. But Caleb knew in his heart that his life with Aster was never about one victory alone. Just then the radio in the rescue truck crackled to life, followed by the urgent voice of the dispatcher. "Caleb, we've just received an emergency call. K-9 team needed in the northern sector." Caleb turned toward Aster. The dog was already on his feet, body tense, tail giving a slight wag, eyes lit like a torch, ready to lead the way. Caleb smiled, rising to his feet and brushing the snow from his clothes. "Looks like it's time again, my friend." The truck's engine roared back to life, headlights slicing through the last thin veil of snow. While the town remained wrapped in the relief and love of their safe return, Caleb and Aster turned toward the dark road beyond the valley, where another journey waited. Tonight for White Hollow would be a night never forgotten. And for Caleb and Aster, it was only another page in the endless diary of those who keep hope alive in the storm. The story of Aria, Maeve, Caleb, and the German shepherd Aster is not just a thrilling rescue in the heart of a snowstorm. It is living proof of friendship, courage, and the unbreakable bond between people and animals. In the fragile moments, when the line between hope and despair thinned to nothing, Aster's sharp instinct, strength, and loyal heart became a shield for life itself. German shepherds have long been known for their intelligence, resilience, and deep capacity for affection. But this story shows that their value lies not only in their rescue skills or protective nature. It is also in their silent companionship, their readiness to share warmth and comfort with those who need it most. The greatest message here is that loving animals is not only about care, but also about respect, about treasuring the gifts they bring into our lives. Every glance, every steady step Aster took reminds us that loyalty and love do not need words to be understood. They are spoken in presence, in action. When you close this chapter, may you carry with you a greater compassion for animals, a heart more open to protecting those who quietly make our world kinder. And perhaps one day, that very love will be the guiding light that carries you through your own storm.